There is a peculiar silence that descends upon the soul when it first awakens to the realization that it feels more than the world around it. I have witnessed in the quietest corners of my clinic and the deepest recesses of my own being the strange and haunting experience of those I would call the empaths, those for whom the emotional undercurrents of existence become not simply a background melody, but the symphony itself. They move through life as tuning forks to the world's psychic vibrations, and though such sensitivity may seem a gift, it arrives, often unbidden, as a curse. I would like to speak to you tonight, not as a scientist peering through the cold lens of empiricism, but as a fellow traveler of the unconscious, as a sojourner of symbols, dreams, and that ancient darkness which both frightens and fascinates us. The empath, as I have come to observe, is a child of a paradox, a being marked by an uncanny attunement to the energies of others, and yet perpetually endangered by the very currents they absorb. Imagine for a moment the myth of Narcissus, not in his vanity, but in his doom, condemned to reflect endlessly the emotions and wounds of all who pass by, never truly able to distinguish where the self ends and the other begins. This, I believe, is the empath's curse. But what is the root of this curse? What psychic soil nourishes such a fate? The answer, as with all things in the psyche, lies hidden beneath the surface, in the strata of the unconscious, in the interplay of archetypes that shape our destinies. Long ago, I posited the existence of what I termed the collective unconscious, a vast, impersonal realm beneath our individual egos, teeming with primordial images and patterns that I called archetypes. The empath, if you study him or her through the symbolic lens, is an expression of the ancient archetype of the wounded healer, like Jung, the immortal centaur, wounded, yet unable to heal his own pain. The empath is cursed with a wound that never closes, a wound that renders them exquisitely receptive to the suffering of others. They sense not only what is spoken, but also what is hidden, not only what is revealed, but also what is concealed in shadow. In many ways, the empath is initiated, often through trauma or an early psychic shock, into a world where boundaries are illusory and the pain of the world becomes indistinguishable from one's own. But here, I must pause to ask, why does the world so often punish the empath for their sensitivity? Why does society, in its unconsciousness, wield the empath's gift as a weapon against them? I have seen it time and again. The one who feels most is made to bear the burdens of all. They are scapegoated, projected upon, blamed for feeling too much, or worse, accused of fabricating the very wounds they bear. The mechanism, dear friends, is ancient and archetypal. When a tribe or a family cannot bear to look upon its own pain, it unconsciously selects an emissary, a vessel, a scapegoat, onto whom it can project its unwanted feelings. This is not merely a psychological trick, it is a ritual act as old as humankind. The empath, by virtue of their porous boundaries, becomes the chosen vessel. In this way, their sensitivity, instead of being celebrated, is twisted into a liability, a weapon turned upon themselves. Let us descend further, for the nature of this curse is not only social, but also profoundly internal. The empath, over time, becomes haunted by confusion. Whose pain is this? Is it mine or another's? Is this sorrow my own? Or have I unconsciously ingested the suffering of the collective? Here, we encounter a problem that is both metaphysical and existential. The empath psyche becomes a battleground, a liminal space where the boundaries between self and other dissolve. It is as if the soul stands at the edge of a great ocean, the tides of the collective washing over the shore of individuality, threatening to erode it entirely. This psychic permeability, if left unchecked, becomes a gateway through which the unconscious can invade, possess, and ultimately weaponize the empath's greatest gift against them. In my own explorations, through dreams, through active imagination, through the analysis of myths, I have seen again and again the drama of the empath unfold. A patient once recounted a recurring dream. She wandered through a house filled with mirrors, each reflecting not her own face, but the anguished faces of strangers. As she moved from room to room, the faces multiplied, their expressions of pain and fear growing ever more vivid, until finally, in the last room, she found a mirror with no reflection at all. It was in this emptiness that she awoke, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. I told her, as I tell you now, that this dream is not unique to her, but is the dream of the collective, the plight of the empath who, in bearing too much, risks losing all sense of self. The house is the psyche. The mirrors are the projections of others. The final emptiness is the threat of psychic annihilation. But do not think this is merely metaphor. The body itself becomes the stage for these dramas. The empath so often suffers from unexplained illnesses, ailments of the heart, the gut, the nervous system. These are the psychosomatic signatures of a soul overwhelmed by what it cannot contain. The ancient alchemists spoke of the opus contra naturam, the work against nature, the task of transforming lead into gold, of integrating shadow with light. For the empath, this work is demanded not once, but continually. Each day, each encounter with another human soul. If this alchemical work is neglected, the weight of untransmuted suffering accumulates, and the body, unable to discharge it, becomes a vessel of pain. The world, too, has its interest in maintaining the empath's confusion. Power, in its most insidious form, seeks out those whose boundaries are weakest. In the mythic sense, the vampire is not merely a creature of legend, but a psychological fact, the one who feeds upon the vitality of others. The empath, unable to defend their psychic borders, is prey to such predation. This is how feeling everything becomes a weapon, not by intent, but by unconscious design, the wound left unhealed attracts the predator. The inability to say no, to distinguish, to separate, to claim one's own pain and refuse the pain of another becomes the mechanism by which the empath's gift is turned into a source of suffering. What then is the path forward? Are we to accept this as fate, to resign ourselves to being the sacrificial lambs of the collective unconscious? I do not believe so. The psyche, though marked by destiny, is also endowed with freedom. It is precisely in the recognition of this curse that the seeds of transformation are sown. The first movement, as in all psychological work, is the act of seeing, of naming what has been unnamed, of bringing into the light what has dwelled in darkness. The empath must become, paradoxically, both witness and participant in their own suffering. They must learn to see the archetypal patterns at play, to recognize the difference between feeling and identification, between compassion and enmeshment. Only then does the possibility of individuation arise, the slow, sometimes agonizing process by which the self is forged in the fires of experience, neither swallowed by the collective nor hardened against it. Let me tell you another story. A dream from my own youth. I found myself standing in a vast forest, the trees so thick and ancient that no sunlight could reach the ground. I wandered for what felt like days, lost, until I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old woman, her face lined with the maps of 1,000 sorrows. She beckoned to me, and as I approached, she placed a hand upon my chest and whispered, "This is not all yours to carry." At that moment, I felt a great heaviness lift, as if the burdens of centuries were released. I awoke with tears on my face, the message burning in my mind, to discern, to separate, to recognize what belongs to me and what does not. This is the beginning of healing for the empath, to know that one can feel deeply and yet not be consumed by the world's pain. It is the work of a lifetime, and yet it is the only work worth undertaking. The alchemists, in their secret language, spoke of the union of opposites, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of sun and moon, masculine and feminine, self and shadow. The empath's path is a living enactment of this mystery. In feeling everything, one is invited to know the fullness of humanity, the ecstasy and the agony, the beauty and the terror, but in learning to hold this fullness without collapse, without surrendering the self, the empath transforms the curse into a source of wisdom. They become, as I have written elsewhere, not merely the wounded healer, but the healing wound itself, a paradox, a living symbol, a vessel through which the suffering of the world is witnessed, held, and perhaps in time redeemed. Yet the danger remains, and it is a danger that must be acknowledged, for there are those who, confronted by the light of the empath, will seek to extinguish it, to weaponize it for their own ends. The world is full of those who are threatened by sensitivity who regard feeling as weakness and empathy as a flaw to be exploited. In the myths of old, it is the gentle soul who is most often betrayed, the Abel to the world's Cain, the Orpheus to the world's Maenads, the empath, if unguarded, risks becoming the perpetual victim, the sacrificial offering on the altar of the collective's unconscious needs. It is not enough, therefore, to feel. One must also learn to protect, to discern, to withdraw when necessary. In the coming hours, I wish to explore with you the manifold dimensions of this paradox. How feeling everything becomes both the path and the pitfall, the blessing and the bane. We shall look to dreams and symbols, to myth and memory, to the ways in which the unconscious seeks to balance the scales, often through suffering. We shall ask together how one might become a steward of their own soul, neither hardened against the world nor dissolved within it. For the fate of the empath is not simply to endure, but to awaken, to become, in the fullest sense, an individual who can hold the pain of the world without losing themselves in its depths. Let us continue our journey deeper into the mystery as we seek the light that flickers, even now, within the heart of the darkness. As we venture further into the labyrinth of the empath's experience, I ask you to consider the double-edged nature of sensitivity, a sword forged in the fires of both vulnerability and latent power. There is a shadow in every gift, just as there is a radiance buried within every wound. If the empath is fated to walk the borderlands between worlds, the visible and the invisible, the conscious and the unconscious, it is not only as a victim, but also as a potential alchemist of the soul. The ancient stories whisper of the one who walks between realms, the psychopomp who guides the living and the dead. Mercury, with winged sandals, slips between opposites with ease, bearing messages and facilitating transitions. The empath, if awakened, may likewise serve as a bridge, not merely between people, but between the deeper layers of the psyche itself. Yet, the danger of such a role lies in forgetting one's own ground, of losing one's roots while soaring among the clouds of feeling. The empath who cannot anchor themselves will be buffeted by every psychic wind, their energies scattered, their boundaries dissolved. It is here that the curse becomes most potent, when one's gift is no longer a conscious choice, but an unconscious compulsion. Much of what passes for empathy in our world is not empathy at all, but a kind of psychic contagion. The boundaries of the self, ill-formed or shattered by early trauma, become permeable to the point of dissolution. The child who, in order to survive, learns to attune to the moods and needs of their caregivers, carries this pattern forward into adulthood. They become exquisitely sensitive, yes, but also haunted by the ever-present anxiety that the world's emotions may engulf or annihilate them. Their sense of self becomes a mosaic of other people's desires, fears, and wounds. They absorb the atmospheres of rooms, the pain behind a glance, the grief concealed in a sigh. This hyper-attunement, though often mistaken for love or care, is in truth a relic of psychic survival, a mechanism to stave off chaos. Rejection or abandonment, when feeling becomes a weapon, it is often wielded not by the empath, but against them by the unintegrated shadows of those around them. Consider the dynamics of projection. The psyche, as I have written, is both creative and destructive. It seeks wholeness, yet it also longs to escape its own darkness. What cannot be owned within the self is cast outward. Finding a host in the susceptible other, the empath, porous and open, becomes a screen for the projections of the collective. The anger unacknowledged, the shame disowned, the sadness never grieved. The moment the empath begins to process these feelings, to make them conscious, the world may recoil. For the act of seeing one's own shadow reflected in another is profoundly unsettling. Thus, the empath is blamed for the feelings they merely reveal, punished for the light they shine on the darkness others would rather ignore. But the weaponization of empathy is not always external. There is a subtle violence that empaths inflict upon themselves, often without awareness. The need to help, to heal, to save others from pain becomes a mask, an unconscious defense against the terror of their own emptiness, their own unmet wounds. The archetype of the martyr looms here, seductive and destructive. If only I can feel enough, give enough, suffer enough, perhaps I will be worthy of love. Perhaps the world will finally see me. This is the echo of the child's hope. The original wound replayed in endless variations. But the world is rarely so generous, and the price of perpetual self-sacrifice is nothing less than the slow erosion of the soul. To make sense of this, let us turn again to the language of dreams. In one analysis, I worked with a man plagued by nightmares of drowning. In each dream, he found himself submerged in dark, endless water, his limbs heavy, his breath stolen by the cold embrace of the deep. Sometimes other figures appeared, friends, lovers, strangers, all reaching for him, all crying out for rescue. Yet the more he tried to save them, the deeper he sank. Only when he ceased struggling, when he let the current carry him, did the water grow clear and the fear dissolve. I told him that this dream, like all dreams, spoke in the tongue of symbols. The water was the collective unconscious, the cries for help, the projections of others. His compulsion to rescue was, paradoxically, the very thing that kept him trapped. Salvation, for him, would never come from saving others, but from releasing the fantasy that he alone could bear the world's pain. So, too, for the empath, the urge to absorb, to heal, to take on more than one's share, is rarely a path to wholeness. It is rather an invitation to psychic fragmentation, to chronic fatigue, to a life lived at the mercy of forces beyond one's control. This is not empathy in its true sense. True empathy requires boundaries, a clear sense of self, an ability to witness the suffering of others without drowning in it. It is a capacity to stand at the threshold of another's world, to feel with them, but not to become them. The uninitiated empath is all threshold, no door. They have not yet learned the sacred art of saying enough, of closing the gate when the tide rises too high. We live in a culture that romanticizes empathy but rarely understands it. The empath is praised for their sensitivity, even as they are subtly punished for it. They are told to be strong, to toughen up, to let things go. The paradox is painful. Feel everything, but do not let it show. Be open, but do not be overwhelmed. Care deeply, but do not become a burden. In such a landscape, the empath becomes adept at hiding their suffering, presenting a mask of composure, while inside they are battered by emotional storms. They learn to distrust their own perceptions, to minimize their needs, to shrink themselves, so as not to offend the fragile egos of those around them. The archetype of the wounded healer is not an idle metaphor. It is a living reality, enacted in 1,000 subtle ways. The healer, unable to heal themselves, becomes obsessed with healing others, hoping, always hoping, that redemption will come through sacrifice. But the world does not reward martyrdom. The more the empath gives, the more is asked, the more boundaries are dissolved, the more the collective unconscious floods. In time, the empath may become resentful, embittered, or withdrawn their gift, unguarded, courtless, into our course. There is a necessary violence in the act of individuation, the process by which the self is forged from the raw material of experience. The empath must learn to separate, to differentiate, to claim what is theirs and return what belongs to others. This is not selfishness, but self-preservation, the precondition for genuine love. The boundary is not a wall but a membrane, permeable yet resilient, allowing exchange without loss of identity. In the alchemical vessel, only that which survives the fire emerges as gold. So too with the empath, only by passing through the ordeal of separation can they reclaim their gift as a source of strength. In my own encounters with the unconscious, I have seen the power of symbols to illuminate this journey. The Ouroboros, the serpent that devours its own tail, is the symbol of the self-sustaining cycle, the process by which the psyche consumes and renews itself. For the empath, the danger is to become the serpent devoured by the world, endlessly consuming the pain of others without ever nourishing themselves. The task then is to turn inward, to become aware of the cycle, to interrupt it where necessary, to feel deeply, yes, but also to retreat, to rest, to restore. You may ask, how is this possible in a world that demands so much, that punishes withdrawal as selfishness? The answer, as always, lies in the depths. The empath must cultivate an inner sanctuary, a space of refuge, of solitude, of silence. This is not a flight from the world, but a return to the self. In the quiet, one learns to distinguish between what is essential and what is extraneous, what is one's own and what has been inherited or imposed. The voice of the self, long drowned out by the clamor of others' needs, begins to speak once more. And yet, this is not a linear path, but a spiral. Each return to the self reveals new layers, new wounds, new possibilities. The empath, if willing, becomes a psychonaut of their own soul, descending again and again into the depths, returning each time with greater wisdom, greater resilience, greater clarity. The wound does not disappear, but it ceases to define. The gift remains, but it is now a conscious gift, not a curse. Consider again the house of mirrors from the earlier dream. As analysis proceeds, as consciousness grows, the mirrors begin to crack, to dissolve. The empath sees not only the faces of others, but also their own, a face both familiar and strange, shaped by suffering, but radiant with new understanding. The emptiness that once seemed so threatening becomes a spaciousness, an openness to possibility, no longer a victim of projection. The empath becomes a witness, a conscious participant in the unfolding drama of the psyche. In the coming reflections, I wish to guide you further into this work, to explore the methods by which the empath may reclaim their boundaries, to examine the role of shadow and projection, to invite the conscious engagement with the archetypal forces that move within and without. For this is the true work, not to escape the curse, but to transmute it, to discover within the wound the possibility of healing within the curse. The seed of transformation, the journey is long and often lonely, but it is not without companions. The myths and dreams of humanity, the symbols that rise from the depths, are faithful guides. Trust them, attend to them, let them lead you back to yourself, again and again, until the gift you carry becomes not a weapon wielded by others, but a light that illuminates the path for all who wander in darkness. The night is deepest just before the dawn of realization. There is a peculiar stage in the journey of the empath when the suffering becomes so constant, so woven into the very rhythm of existence, that it feels almost sacred, an initiation into an ancient lineage of those who carry the world's pain in silence. But suffering, though it marks the threshold of transformation, must not become an altar at which one sacrifices the totality of one's life. There is a subtle danger here, to confuse depth of feeling with purpose, to mistake the agony of absorption for the call of destiny. The empath, seduced by the sorrow of the world, may abandon their own story, their own dreams, and thus wander the borderlands as a ghost among the living, haunted by echoes that do not belong to them, lost in a fog of borrowed emotion. To awaken from this trance, the empath must descend even deeper, beyond the level of emotion, to the roots of the symbolic. In dreams and in waking reverie, the unconscious offers images that both wound and heal. The dreamer who finds themselves lost in a storm, drenched and shivering, is confronted not simply by weather, but by the elemental forces of the psyche itself. What is the rain, if not the tears of the unlived life, the longing of the soul for expression? What is the storm, if not the turmoil of unintegrated energies, swirling at the threshold of consciousness, demanding recognition? There was a patient, a woman whose entire body seemed to tremble with the unspoken grief of her ancestors. She wept not only for herself, but for generations past, women silenced, children forgotten, wars never mourned. In her dreams, she walked endless corridors, each door opening onto a scene of suffering she could not prevent. Her waking life echoed the same. Every encounter became a channel for pain. Every relationship a battleground for wounds unhealed. In our work together, it became clear that her empathy was not merely personal but ancestral, archetypal. She was the vessel chosen by her lineage to feel what others had denied. The weight was crushing until she realized through symbol and ritual that her task was not to heal the world, but to witness it, to carry the flame of consciousness into the darkness of history. Only then did the images in her dreams begin to change. The endless corridors became gardens, the doors gateways to possibility, the suffering a field from which new life could spring. It is this transformation from identification to witness, from martyrdom to mindful presence, that marks the true path of individuation for the empath. The unconscious does not ask us to solve the world's pain, but to acknowledge it, to allow it a place at the table of our awareness. In this act of radical hospitality, the wound is no longer a prison, but a threshold, a place of meeting between self and other, between the finite ego and the infinite depths. Yet the shadow is never far. For every movement toward consciousness, there is a counter-movement in the dark. The empath, awakening to the symbolic meaning of their suffering, may be visited by dreams of betrayal, abandonment, or violence. The psyche resists change, for change threatens the status quo of inner arrangements, the hidden bargains made in childhood and maintained through habit and fear. The archetypes rise in protest: the victim, the rescuer, the persecutor, each demanding their due, each insisting on the reality of the old wound. But symbols, once seen, cannot be unseen. The dreamer who faces a serpent in the garden is changed forever, whether by terror or by awe. The serpent, ancient emblem of wisdom and renewal, reminds us that suffering is also a form of knowledge, that every descent into the underworld brings the possibility of rebirth. The empath, too, is invited to shed their old skin, to risk the vulnerability of transformation, to enter the unknown with only the flicker of inner light as a guide. There is another danger here, subtle yet profound, the temptation to weaponize one's own suffering. The empath, unhealed, may become a master of guilt, a weaver of invisible chains. See how much I feel for you, how much I bear. Why will you not love me as I deserve? Why do you not see my pain? The shadow of empathy is manipulation, the unconscious demand that others recognize and repay the debt of feeling. This dynamic, though rarely acknowledged, poisons relationships and perpetuates cycles of wounding. The victim becomes the persecutor, the healer becomes the source of new pain. Thus, the weapon, once wielded by others, is taken up by the empaths themselves, turned inward and outward in an endless spiral. To escape this spiral, the way is paradoxical. One must turn away from both self-pity and self-sacrifice, from both martyrdom and resentment. The only freedom lies in humility, in the willingness to see oneself as neither savior nor victim, but as a participant in the great dance of becoming. The pain, then, is not a badge of honor, nor a burden to be flaunted, but a signpost pointing toward deeper integration. The archetype of the alchemist becomes a guiding figure. At this stage, the alchemist does not reject lead because it is heavy, nor gold because it is rare. Rather, he seeks the union of opposites, the reconciliation of what seems irreconcilable. The empath, in this sense, is called to a similar task, to hold both joy and sorrow, both solitude and connection, both the need to feel and the right to rest. This is the conjunctio oppositorum, the sacred marriage that gives birth to the true self. It is a long, slow labor, fraught with setbacks and doubts, but it is the only labor worth undertaking. As we proceed, I invite you to notice the symbols that arise in your own life, the recurring images, the emotional themes, the moments when you feel most alive or most wounded. The unconscious speaks in the language of metaphor and myth. It is a patient teacher, but only for those willing to listen. If you dream of water, ask yourself what seeks expression, what longs to be cleansed or renewed. If you dream of fire, consider what is being burned away, what new light is seeking to emerge. The empath's journey is not a solitary path. Though it may feel lonely, the archetypes walk with you, as do the ancestors, the guides, the hidden allies who inhabit the dreamtime of the soul. And yet, always, the task returns to boundaries not as walls of stone, but as living membranes that breathe and flex, allowing exchange without collapse. The art of the empath is the art of containment, of feeling without being flooded, of loving without losing oneself, of seeing without absorbing all. This is not a skill taught by the world, but one learned in the crucible of experience, honed by suffering, polished by awareness. There is great beauty in this work. The empath, conscious and whole, becomes a blessing, a presence of healing, a channel for grace, a mirror in which others may see themselves more clearly, their suffering transmuted by the fire of awareness becomes wisdom, compassion, and quiet strength. They are no longer at the mercy of every storm, but learn to ride the winds of feeling, to navigate the tides of collective emotion with the steadiness of an ancient sailor steering by the stars. I have spoken often of the shadow, that vast realm of denied and repressed energies that lies beneath the threshold of awareness. For the empath, the shadow is both danger and opportunity. Every feeling absorbed from others contains a fragment of one's own unlived life. The anger that terrifies, the sorrow that overwhelms, the desire that shames, these are not only the property of others, but also messages from the depths, invitations to reclaim what has been lost or given away. To integrate the shadow is not to banish darkness, but to become whole, to stand in the center of one's own circle, unafraid of either light or dark, knowing that both are needed for the dance of life. The world, in its haste, will urge you to hurry past this work, to medicate the pain, to distract from the discomfort, to deny the wound. But the wound, as the poets have long known, is where the light enters. The empath's curse is not to suffer endlessly, but to discover in suffering a doorway into the mystery of being. It is a calling, an initiation, a summons to a deeper participation in the story of humanity. So if you find yourself feeling too much, caring too deeply, suffering without apparent cause, do not despair. You are not broken, nor are you alone. You are a vessel for the world's dreams and sorrows, a bridge between the personal and the collective, the conscious and the unconscious. The work before you is not easy, nor is it often recognized, but it is noble, and it is necessary, for in your willingness to feel, to suffer, to witness, you become a living answer to the world's forgotten questions. Let us rest here for a moment in this awareness, gathering our breath, feeling the pulse of the living world around us, sensing the deep currents that move beneath the surface of our daily lives. The journey continues, always, but in this pause there is space for gratitude, for humility, for the quiet joy of being. And so, as we move into the softer hours of reflection, I ask you to notice the peculiar serenity that follows an honest reckoning with one's own depths. There is a sacred quiet that emerges after the storm of feeling a hush, not of emptiness, but of spaciousness, a silence charged with presence. The empath, who has endured the shattering winds of projection, the ache of the world's sorrow, may at last begin to sense the contours of their own being, distinct yet woven into the fabric of existence. This is the fruit of long suffering, of conscious descent into the underworld of feeling. It is a fragile and tremulous clarity, as if the soul were a pool whose surface has at last grown still, reflecting not the faces of others, but the secret sky of one's own interiority. To arrive at such a moment is not to achieve finality, but to stand at the ever-renewing threshold of becoming. The wound remains, but it no longer festers in darkness. It breathes, it sings. It is as if one has at last found the courage to hold sorrow and joy together in the same cupped hands. Trembling but unbroken, the self, so long hidden beneath the strata of others' expectations, at last draws breath and opens its eyes. Here, the curse of the empath is transformed, if not into a blessing, then into a deeper humanity, a kinship with all who suffer and strive and seek. You may find in such moments a yearning for new ways of being. The heart grows restless, eager to inhabit a world unmediated by endless feeling, to taste the fruit of one's own desires without guilt, to rest in one's own skin, as in a home well loved and hard won. This is the nascent longing for individuation, the soul's instinct to become what it is, to answer the summons of the archetype that waits in the shadow, luminous and wild. For the true vocation of the empath is not self-effacement, but self-creation, not ceaseless absorption, but the conscious shaping of one's inner life into a vessel capable of loving, seeing, and creating without dissolution. Yet the pull of old patterns is strong. The child who learned to survive by feeling everything must gently, persistently learn the new language of boundaries, of saying no, and yes, with equal authority. This is not a rejection of empathy, but its transmutation. The sword, once wielded against oneself, becomes, by degrees, an instrument of discernment, a capacity to cut through confusion, to separate the true from the false, to know the difference between compassion and compulsion. There is an alchemical wisdom in this. The opposites, once held apart, are allowed to meet and interpenetrate, to fertilize one another in the secret soil of the psyche. You may ask, how does one begin? How is this labor of self-becoming, this art of conscious feeling, actually lived? The answer is neither simple nor reducible to method. The psyche is not a machine, but a living mystery. It resists all schemes and shortcuts, requiring instead a sustained fidelity to its own rhythms, its own images, its own voice. I have found in my own long wrestling with the unconscious that transformation is less an act of will than a surrender to the wisdom already present within. The dreams, the sudden images that arise at dusk, the body's quiet signals, all are emissaries of the self, guides sent from the unseen depths to show the way. The work is to listen, to attend, to heed what stirs in the night. Sometimes the way forward is revealed in the most ordinary of circumstances. A moment of solitude, a walk in the woods, a conversation with a stranger whose words echo your secret questions. The unconscious speaks not only in grand symbols, but in the thousand small choices by which we shape our days. The empaths, awakening to their own reality, may begin to notice when the body tightens in the presence of certain people, when the heart quickens in response to unspoken needs, when a sense of fatigue or anxiety signals the subtle crossing of a boundary. To notice is already to begin. Awareness is the seed of change over time. This noticing ripens into a gentle discipline, a way of being in the world that is at once open and rooted receptive and discerning, one learns to pause before absorbing another's mood, to ask inwardly, is this mine? One learns to honor the body as the first oracle of the psyche, to trust its signals of discomfort or ease, contraction or expansion. The empath who was once helpless before the flood of collective emotion becomes, through practice, a steward of their own energies, a guardian of the temple of the self. This is not to say that suffering vanishes or that empathy ceases to ache. The world remains wounded. The currents of collective pain run deep and strong, but the self, no longer porous and unguarded, becomes a vessel that can hold sorrow without drowning. A hearth in which the wild energies of life are welcomed and given shape. The archetype of the healer is not abolished but fulfilled. The wound, instead of festering in secrecy, becomes the site of initiation, the place where life is deepest and most real. And there is, in this ongoing journey, a return to wonder, a childlike sense of possibility that arises when one is no longer defined by trauma or loss. The world, once overwhelming in its demands, becomes again a place of beauty and strangeness, a stage for the unfolding of one's own myth. The dreams that once threatened now become allies. The symbols that once wounded now nourish. The empath, restored to themselves, finds that they can move among others without losing the thread of their own being, that they can love without depletion, give without resentment, feel without fear. It is here, in the luminous heart of darkness, that the great work of transformation continues. Each day brings new invitations to descend, to feel, to witness, to rise. The self is not a fixed entity, but a living process, a dance of opposites, a weaving of light and shadow, a becoming that never ends. To live as an empath, consciously and courageously, is to accept this never-ending work, to meet each feeling as both guest and teacher, to allow oneself to be changed by the encounter, to let the wound teach without dictating the terms of life. As I near the end of this meditation, I sense a gathering stillness in this hall, a hush as of something sacred drawing near. Perhaps you feel it too. The presence of all who have struggled to live with open hearts in a wounding world, all who have carried the curse of feeling as both burden and grace. You are not alone. The lineage is ancient. The work is shared. The suffering you know is the suffering of humanity, and in facing it consciously, you become a healer not only of yourself but of the world soul. Now, as the old myths teach, the circle must be completed. The journey, though unending, comes to rest for a time in the sanctuary of reflection. I invite you, as we part, to tend your own depths with reverence and patience. Let your dreams speak. Let your body guide. Let your suffering become a source of wisdom rather than a chain of fate. Withdraw when you must. Return when you are ready. Let the world's voices be a chorus rather than a command. Above all, trust that the self you are seeking is already present. waiting for you in the quiet places beneath the noise. There are no easy tasks to offer, no lists of rules to follow, only the lifelong art of noticing, of pausing, of honoring what arises. Walk in the woods and listen to your dreams. Place your hand upon your heart when the world grows loud. Welcome solitude as a friend, and let soul be a teacher, not a tyrant. Cultivate the sanctuary within and visit it often. Speak to your own soul as you would to a beloved child, gently, truthfully, with faith in its ultimate healing. In this way, the curse is slowly unbound, the weapon disarmed, the gift reclaimed. You become yourself, wounded and whole, finite and infinite, a singular flame in the vastness of night. This, then, is the labor and the invitation to feel everything, but to become nothing but yourself, to carry the world's sorrow, but to dwell in your own soul, to be, at last, not a shadow in another story, but the author of your own myths alive, awake and at peace